Marijuana prohibition has failed. Though it may have been well-intentioned to begin with, marijuana prohibition has been ineffective at reducing cannabis availability and has instead created many problems. The most obvious concerns relate to the growth of organized crime and gang violence. But what about the $1 trillion that has been spent on the war on drugs in North America over the last 40 years? Despite this astronomical price tag and ever-growing rates of marijuana-related arrests, the price of marijuana has gone down, while the potency has gone up. Things have become so bad these days that young people have easier access to marijuana than to alcohol and cigarettes. This whole thing has been a huge failure. Policy has to change. In British Columbia, the marijuana market is estimated to be worth up to $7 billion, double the total revenue of BC's agriculture, forestry, and fishing sectors combined. These massive illegal revenues fuel crime, violence, and corruption across the province and help fund criminal activities like importing cocaine and guns. While marijuana use is not free from harms, health experts have concluded that alcohol and tobacco are much more dangerous. In fact, experts believe that a regulated legal market for adult marijuana use is the best way to protect public health and improve public safety. The strict regulation of marijuana has the potential to eliminate the violent illegal marijuana market and to raise untold tax revenue, while at the same time ending wasteful marijuana law enforcement spending that only drains tax dollars.
My name is Gary Johnson. There was a time when this was the most dangerous drug society had to deal with. Today it's harder for a kid to get a hold of this drug than it was in 1929. In 2012, alcohol-related crime is down and America is a safer place. Addicts are dealt with in rehab facilities, not prisons. Why then do we not apply this lesson to marijuana? 900,000 marijuana arrests a year at a cost of tens of billions of dollars, while overcrowding our prisons, tying up our legal system, and escalating drug-related crime and border violence. President Obama redoubled his efforts to prosecute its use, raiding medical marijuana facilities in increasing numbers. Wasn't this the same President Obama who just as famously smoked it? The fact is, marijuana users are no more criminal than our commander-in-chief. So what's up, Mr. President? It's okay for you to do it, but everybody else should be arrested and go to jail? The social, economic, and health costs associated with today's drug prohibition are too high. Obama isn't being smart about legalization. Ditto Romney. That leaves me as the last sane man standing on this issue. Let's remember the lesson our great-grandparents learned at such tremendous cost. Legalize it, tax it, regulate it. Move forward.
My name is Jim Gierach, and I'm here with LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, to support the Caravan for Peace with justice and dignity. And I want to welcome the Caravan for Peace to Chicago. Chicago, the home of Al Capone and the home of Prohibition. Legalize drugs doesn't mean to make more drugs available. It means to stop making more drugs available that are uncontrolled and unregulated. Law enforcement officers now are joining hands and saying it's time to end the war on drugs in order to restore peace and justice to our communities, to stop incarcerating people to the point that we can't afford schools, the problem with guns, gangs, crime, and to start saving our children.
The government has as much of a right to control what I as an adult put into my body as it does what I put into my mind. It's none of their business. When I was appointed to the bench by Governor Dubnation at the end of 1983, I was still a drug warrior. You know, I'd been a member of Navy JAG, actually writing charge sheets against my fellow shipmates from the Naval Air Station in Guam who had been run afoul of various laws, certainly including drug laws. I was a criminal defense attorney representing other people from different stations who were charged with drug offenses, among others. And then I was a federal prosecutor for several years in Los Angeles. In fact, I held the record for the largest drug prosecution in the Central District of California back in 1978. 75 kilos of heroin, 160 pounds, which was and is a whole lot of heroin. Does anyone have a concept of what the drug prosecution record is today in the Central District of California? 18 tons of cocaine in one place, actually in Sylmar. So you begin to look at your own experience. You look at what's going on in your own courtroom. You're churning low-level drug offenders through the system for no good purpose whatsoever. You are arresting some even high-level dealers. And if you do that, does that mean that heroin is no longer available on the streets of Santa Ana or wherever? No, it doesn't mean that at all. It just means that somebody else sees that as an employment opportunity. And I came to the realization at that time, and that realization has to be understood by others. The tougher we get with regard to drug crime, literally the softer we get with regard to the prosecution of everything else. In 1990, we were only half as successful in prosecuting homicides countrywide as we had been in 1980. Why? Well, because the Reagan administration once again had ratcheted up the war on drugs, so we were using all of these prosecutorial resources to prosecute nonviolent drug offenders, such that robbers, rapers, and murderers were being able to skate with regard to their charges because we didn't devote those resources for that offense. Who is winning today with regard to this failed policy? And I have 6 groups. Travel along with me and see if you agree. The first group, obviously, are the drug lords. Big-time drug dealers. They're making hundreds of millions, billions of dollars every year, tax-free, by the way, and they're clearly winning. The number 2 group of people that are winning are those in juvenile gangs. Pretty much every juvenile gang we have in our country gets its primary source of funding for the sale of illegal drugs, and now they're using it as a recruiting tool to bring more children into this lifestyle because they too can be part of the action and make some money. Number 3 group of people that are winning are basically those in law enforcement that are making big-time government money to fight against the first 2 groups. And I'm not pointing the finger at law enforcement. They haven't failed us any more for the war on drugs than Elliot Ness failed us with regard to the war on alcohol. But it's the system. But nevertheless, their bureaucracies have expanded, their amounts of money, their power have all expanded as well. They're winning. Fourth group of people are the politicians that basically talk tough with regard to the war on drugs, not smart, but they get elected and re-elected by talking tough. Of course, it's our fault because we continue to elect them, but they come out ahead. Number 5 groups are those in the private sector that make money because of increased crime. Who might that be? Obviously, the people that build prisons, enormously lucrative occupation. People that staff prisons. In the state of California, the Prison Guards Union is the strongest political lobby group we have. They're winning, and of course, they're laughing at us. And the 6th group of people that are winning are the terrorist organizations of the world. You look at any terrorist organization from Osama bin Laden or anywhere else, the primary source of funding is drug money. It's the sale of illegal drugs, to the degree that I say that drug prohibition is the golden goose of terrorism. And if our government really wanted to do something damaging to terrorist groups around the world, they would take the one step that would do that: repeal drug prohibition. Who is losing? Everybody else. I've been speaking actively against our nation's drug policy since 1992. The first national TV show I was on, they basically stacked it with a lot of parents of drug problems for their kids. And the first question I got was, why are you trying to kill my son? And it kind of got worse from there. That doesn't happen anymore. People are beginning to understand. There is an initiative now in California to treat marijuana like alcohol for adults. What would happen if this were to pass? Well, 6 things. The first 5 demonstrably beneficial, then we'll talk about the 6th. The first thing that would happen is we in the state of California as taxpayers literally could save hundreds of millions of dollars per year, if not $1 billion a year, that now we actually spend in a futile effort to try to eradicate marijuana as well as to prosecute and incarcerate nonviolent marijuana offenders. And of course, you can tell how successful we are in the eradication of marijuana because it's still the largest cash crop in the state of California. And number 2 is grapes, by the way, if you care. So that's $1 billion or so that we can save. Number 2, We could tax the silly stuff and generate revenue, according to the chair of the State Board of Equalization, of about $1.3 billion every year. So now that's about a $2.3 billion shift in the budget deficit for the state of California. You'd think somebody would notice. But the third thing trumps the first two, and that is we would make marijuana less available for children than it is today. That is something that really does deserve a great deal of attention. Number four, the entire hemp industry could be revitalized. It goes back thousands of years to the degree that in ancient Greek, the word canvas and cannabis were synonymous. They were the same word. And we have simply thwarted that entire really important industrial purpose. We do have our merchants using hemp today, and by the way, hemp, you know, is just the stalk of the marijuana plant. It has no mind-altering properties whatsoever, but it can be used for all kinds of really beneficial purposes. So now our merchants import the raw material from those radical countries like Canada and England, for heaven's sake, penalizing ourselves and our own agricultural purposes. You'd think that we could somehow realize what's going on, because the Canadian hemp field is worth, you know, about $1 billion a year. And the fifth thing, this entire medical marijuana issue would pretty much dissolve, and hooray for that. It would get some control on it, regulate it, control it, tax it, and bring it back under the law. Then there's the sixth thing. What's that going to do to marijuana usage by adults? And any economist, of course, will tell you that's really pretty simple. It will increase marijuana use by adults. All things being equal. But all things are not going to be equal. We'll probably soon start experiencing what I call the Holland effect. Because in Holland, anybody 16 years of age or older can go to a coffee house and can get coffee and sandwiches and tea and also marijuana and hashish. The Minister of Health of Holland held a press conference not all that long ago and said, we in our country have only half the marijuana consumption per capita as you do in the United States of America, both for adults and for teenagers. Wait a minute, you hear that? Both for adults and for teenagers. Then went on to explain why. You know what he said? He said, we have succeeded in making pot boring. People that are supporting the status quo are on the wrong side of history. Just like the people that the Billy Sundays and the Anslingers and the rest who supported alcohol prohibition were on the wrong side of history. It's just a question of when. And then I guarantee anyone who will listen that 2 years after we change away from this failed and hopeless policy, everybody will join arms, look back astonished, aghast that we could have perpetuated such a failed system for so long. The best thing I can do for my country is to help us repeal drug prohibition. It's the most patriotic thing that I'm able to do, and we're going to be successful.
It's outrageous when you call me over.
Shootings and gang violence have grown exponentially in recent years.
Abbotsford police say the gang problem has more than doubled in 5 years.
We are not having any success on marijuana prohibition in Canada. My mother said to me when I was very, very young, do the right thing, not the popular thing. It's very difficult for police officers to come out and say that the war on drugs has been a failure. From day one in the academy, we were taught as police officers that the way to deal with problems is to arrest people and put people in jail. And even myself as a young officer, starting in 1979, believed that we could arrest our way out of this particular problem. But over the years, as I went forward in my law enforcement career, I realized that years and years and years of spending money on enforcing prohibition for drugs has been a failure. And that is the feeling with many, many police leaders, but they publicly will not say it until they leave policing, because the culture will eat you up. And I have experienced this. They labeled me as not being one of them, as being an advocate for the drug user. Drug dealers are regulating marijuana right now. It's easier for our youth right now to go out and buy marijuana than it is to purchase alcohol and cigarettes. We need to start thinking long term. Number one is dealing with the issue of marijuana and ending prohibition and taxing the revenue that can come from marijuana. There is absolutely no way we will deal with our drug problems with our current policies simply because there is far too much money to be made selling illicit drugs in this world. When I was a commanding officer of the drug unit, we had record-breaking interdiction of drugs here in Vancouver. We had record-breaking arrests. And we quickly realized that it did not make one iota difference, and the price did not change by 1 cent. And we found an increase in violence simply because the void has to be filled. People will get involved in the trade to make a lot of money because it is still illegal. The great demand for marijuana produced in British Columbia is the United States. So if the gangs can get their product to the United States, they can use that money to purchase cocaine to bring it back here into BC to even triple their profits. It's criminal organizations that are benefiting from the prohibition of drugs, especially the prohibition of marijuana here in British Columbia. The gang situation in Metro Vancouver is very, very serious. And we've had in excess of 300 people killed based on this prohibition of marijuana and the fact that they're getting involved in it to make some easy money. And they're not going to think twice about taking out someone in order for them to make more of a profit. If we continue with our current drug policies in Canada, we will have an increasing rate of gang violence in our communities. I'm in the political world right now. Hypocrisy is rampant. We, as citizens of Canada, need to stand up and advocate for contemporary drug policies. Let's end marijuana prohibition. Let's stop the violence that's taking place here in British Columbia. Let's end it now by ending prohibition.
My name's John Delaney. I live in Bryan, Texas. I'm a retired state district court judge.
And I'm Russ Jones. I'm also from Texas. I'm in the Hill Country out near Austin and San Antonio. I was a police officer in San Jose, narcotics detective, DEA task force agent. I worked intelligence for our government in Nicaragua during the Iran-Contra affair.
In 1983, my mother was murdered in my family home in Houston by a young man, 21 years old, who had come down from Michigan as a result of the latest economic crisis there, and was out of work. And I think he was out of work because he was not so very long before that convicted of marijuana possession. And being out of work, he didn't have a car, and walking down the street he saw her car, and he went to the door and gained entrance and demanded her car keys, he later said in his confession, and she wouldn't give the car keys. So that resulted in a struggle that caused her death. And 13 years later, the state of Texas executed that fellow, but it cost me a mother. And my children grew up without a grandmother. So the war on drugs has touched me in ways that are very personal. And so I've made the dedication that I'm going to do what I can to raise another voice from the law enforcement community about the need to go about all this in a very different way.
You know, when we arrested a drug dealer, all we were doing was creating an immediate job opening for another drug dealer because there was so much money involved. There was no reduction in crime. The war on drugs was not reducing crime. It wasn't reducing drug use. It surely wasn't reducing death and illness and disease. And the use of drugs kept going up. So by the time I left DEA, I was pretty discouraged with what the nation was doing to itself with the war on drugs. I don't think, though, I think I was able to pull it all together after my trip to the Soviet Union, and it was still the Iron Curtain. It was still the Soviet Union. And I had worked over there with their law enforcement officers. I had worked on the streets with their narcotics detectives. We seized a methamphetamine lab. I saw drug dealing on the streets. I went to their rehabilitation programs and talked to recovering addicts. And I came home and the question kept running through my mind, if the Soviet Union, still behind the Iron Curtain, as controlling of its citizens as it was unable to control drugs through prohibition, then how were we, a free people, ever going to? I came to the conclusion we can't. This is not a problem we're going to arrest our way out of. This is the bottom line. This is a health problem, not a law enforcement problem, and we need to be dealing with this as a health issue.
It bothers me a lot that I have signed several hundred search warrants over my career as a trial court judge. Many times in the middle of the night I would sit at the kitchen table with law enforcement and go over the warrant and sign off on it. And I've now seen police videos of what happens, at least in some of today's searches. And I shudder to think that maybe some of my conduct was a contributing factor there. I'm a child protection court judge today, and I cannot imagine the trauma that afflicts a 7-year-old boy when he sees his pet dog assassinated by police who are here to serve and protect, right? And then they throw his father on the floor and kick him and yell at him and humiliate him, and over what? A baggie of marijuana somewhere in the parents' bedroom? Now he's going to lose his job, going to lose his driver's license. No, got to be a better way.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV, and today we're talking with Major Neil Franklin, retired from the Maryland State Police. He's also the Executive Director of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, a group of cops, law enforcement people, active and retired, who fight against the drug war and its policies. Neil, thanks for talking to us.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
You guys have created a great study that's online at LEAP's website. And you delivered a copy of this to Gil Kurlikowski, the current drug czar. What are you trying to accomplish?
One of the first things we wanted to do was put together a comprehensive look at those past 4 decades, which will focus upon financial cost, human cost, addiction.
Neil, you were at a certain point in your career, you were a drug warrior, and that changed. What happened to flip you on this issue?
When I retired in 1999, I went to work for the Baltimore Police Department. And just a few months after my retirement date, I had a conversation with a comrade of mine, Edward Totley. He was telling me about a case he was working. He was going to make one final buy of cocaine from a mid-level drug dealer. He was working with the FBI on a task force right here in DC. And as we've had in the past, we've had these conversations and we didn't, we weren't thinking about the inherent danger or the possible danger. October 30th, I got a phone call late one night, woke me up, and it was a coworker saying that Ed Totley had been shot. Excuse me. So my wife and I get into the car, and we drive down to PG General Hospital, and it's too late. What had happened, when the dealer, it had driven the dealer to the location to get the drugs. The dealer came back to the car, supposedly with the drugs. And he paused for a moment to extinguish his cigarette, and as soon as he did that, he reached in the car and shot Ed Totley at point blank range in the head. And it was that moment, that night and those weeks after and those months after where I just said, what are we doing? And I started thinking about the other officers that I knew that had died. And just a couple of years after that, more officers in Baltimore City were dying from drug crime. You know, dealers, the prohibition part. And that's when I made my turn. That's when I stumbled across LEAP's website when looking for this information and this research, trying to find others who think like I do.
What is the best way to honor the death of Officer Totley and people like him?
The best way that we can honor them is to completely dismantle this system of prohibition and implement a new system focused on treatment and education, period. We know it, we know that needs to be done. Why don't we just do it?
What are the big round numbers or the findings of the war on drugs? What has it been doing, and what has it been? How has it been affecting American society?
When we first started the war on drugs, we only had a few 100,000 people in prison. Today, we're somewhere around 2.5 million people in prison. Over those 40 years, we've put over 39 million people in prison, and the vast majority of those are from nonviolent drug offenses.
So that's things like simple possession,
yeah,
or low-level dealing.
Low-level dealing, yeah. Right. We're not talking about kingpins, right. And even though we've arrested a few. We're looking at $1.3 trillion spent on law enforcement efforts. We're talking about cops, judges, judicial system, and prisons. That's quite costly. When you look at the number of bodies, look at Mexico. Over the past 5 years alone, since we stepped up efforts in assisting Mexico in fighting back against the cartel, you're looking at over, I think the number sounds like 38,000 people murdered at the hands of the cartel. In Venezuela, it's even more. In our very own country, in our neighborhoods and in our communities, every year, somewhere between 5,000 to 8,000 people murdered at the hands of our neighborhood gangs.
Why do police chiefs push back against the drug war as it's currently constituted? What's it doing to their efforts to actually control crime?
You have to think about the history of how local police got involved in this in the first place. It came from the federal government in the form of funding. Sometimes I use we bribed into getting into this war. Many police agencies now continue to balance their budgets through federal funds, through grants, burn grants, and what have you. And to lose that money would be significant, and you will hear some police chiefs speak to that. And
yet they're against the war on drugs.
Well, they say that it's failed, that it's not working. They just haven't taken the next step to move away from it, to really end it. And so they feel pressured politically, and sometimes you can't blame them, but because they care about their jobs. Politically, they're pressured to toe the federal party line.
What are the things that we can do quickly and immediately to redress that, to start fixing it and get out of this war mentality?
Well, immediately, where you don't need any legislative action whatsoever, the president can move marijuana from a Schedule I category down to a 3 or 4.
And that would mean, currently marijuana is scheduled under federal drug classifications as having no medical value whatsoever.
And then that's already been proven wrong with the 15 states that are now moving in medical marijuana, and with the many doctors behind that. But in doing that, in completely removing it from the schedule system whatsoever, then he gives the authority then to the states to move and to begin to develop models to manage marijuana within their communities. And the next important thing is it's now time for a discussion, not a debate. That's been done. A discussion as to what are the best possible models? How can we manage these dangerous drugs within our communities? We already know that prohibition does not work, so now we have to regulate and control. Let's have the discussion, come up with some solutions.
We've also been down this road before. In the 70s, we heard stories that Philip Morris had trademarked names like Acapulco Gold and Maui Wowie, anticipating the legalization of marijuana. Jimmy Carter seemed to be weeks away before a big scandal broke and pulled back from legalizing drugs in any way, shape, or form. Other countries have decriminalized. Portugal has decriminalized drugs. But are we actually at a different stage of the discussion over the drug war?
Completely different than back in the 70s for a number of reasons. Number one, we didn't have the data that we have today. Prison numbers, financial numbers, body count, we didn't have those numbers. When you look at the leaders from Mexico, the former presidents, have come out with the commission just a couple weeks ago in their report.
Yeah, we have Republican people running for the Republican presidential nomination, people like Gary Johnson and Ron Paul calling for the legalization of drugs.
But here's another significant part. They didn't have LEAP. They didn't have law enforcement against prohibition back in the 70s. And we're making a significant difference because we bring a completely different perspective. We've been on the front lines, we've been out there in this battle, and we can speak from that perspective, letting people know that this is a complete failure.
What is the best way both for civilians and law enforcement to find out more about LEAP?
Well, they can go to copssaylegalizeddrugs.com, and we have a brand new website up, very comprehensive with some very good information, and they really should visit that site.
Major Neil Franklin, retired Maryland State Police, Executive Director of LEAP Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Thanks very much for talking to us.
Thanks, Nick.
I'm Nick Gillespie for Reason TV.